It all started on an ordinary evening, the kind of evening that feels predictable, almost boring. My son Alex was in the living room, bouncing between his toys and the colorful lights on the Christmas tree. My wife was in the kitchen, humming softly while finishing a batch of cookies. The house smelled like cinnamon and pine, with a cozy warmth from the heater. At the dining table, I sat with a steaming cup of tea, staring at the advent calendar we'd bought earlier that week. It wasn't the kind of thing I'd usually notice, but this calendar was different. The frame was made of dark wood, and its design looked almost antique, like something that belonged in an old storybook. Each door was painted with tiny gold numbers, and little carvings surrounded the edges. Stars, moons, and other shapes that didn't seem familiar. My fingers brushed against the wood, and for a moment, I hesitated. It felt smoother than I expected, almost slippery, with a strange oily texture. "Do you like it?" My wife's voice broke through my thoughts. I looked up and smiled faintly. "Yeah, it's interesting." She laughed from the kitchen, a light-hearted sound that usually grounded me. "Alex can't stop talking about it. I bet he's counting the hours until December starts." I nodded but stayed quiet. There was something about the calendar, something I couldn't quite put into words. It wasn't just the way it looked. It was the way it felt. Heavy in a way that didn't make sense. Alex came running up to me, his face lit with excitement. "Can I open the first door, Dad? Please." "It's not time yet, buddy," I said, ruffling his hair. "Tomorrow's the first day of December. You'll have to wait until then." He groaned but grinned at the same time, already looking forward to the small surprises hidden behind each door. I watched him dart back to the tree, his excitement contagious, but my focus returned to the calendar. I picked it up, tilting it slightly, and noticed a faint smell, something unfamiliar. It wasn't strong, but it lingered, like the scent of an old room that hasn't been opened in years. I wanted to ask my wife if she noticed it too, but it felt silly, like I was overthinking a simple Christmas decoration. That night, as we got ready for bed, I placed the calendar on the mantel. Its dark wood stood out against the soft glow of our decorations, almost like it didn't belong. My wife didn't seem to notice. "You're quiet tonight," she said as she pulled back the covers. "Just tired," I replied, though my eyes kept drifting back to the living room. Even as the lights went off and the house settled into its usual nighttime quiet, I couldn't help but feel aware of the calendar. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination. It was late and I was overthinking like I often did. But as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Something small, like a shadow you see out of the corner of your eye. The house felt different that night. The next morning felt like any other day at first. Alex bounded downstairs in his pajamas, his face lit with excitement. He barely waited for his breakfast before rushing to the advent calendar on the mantel. My wife laughed, tying her apron as she prepared to start her baking again. "All right, go ahead," I said, my voice still groggy from sleep. Alex's little fingers tugged at the first door. It opened with a soft creak, revealing a small wooden figurine, a tiny snowman, carved with remarkable detail. He held it up proudly, marveling at the craftsmanship. "That's nice," I said, leaning closer to get a better look. But as I did, something caught my eye. The space behind the door wasn't just an empty cubbyhole for the figurine. It looked deeper, like a tunnel carved into the wood, dark and hollow. I squinted, trying to see where it led, but Alex's hand snapped the door shut before I could get a proper look. "Day one's done," he announced cheerfully, placing the snowman on the table beside him. I shook off the strange feeling. It was just a trick of the light, I told myself. Just my imagination playing games. Later that afternoon, I noticed a small piece of folded paper tucked into the corner of the mantel, near the base of the calendar. It hadn't been there before, or at least I hadn't noticed it. Curious, I picked it up and unfolded it. The paper was aged, yellowed at the edges, and the handwriting was sharp and precise. Only open one door per day. Never skip ahead. Always return the item to the calendar before midnight. The instructions were short, simple, and oddly specific. I frowned, reading them again. Who puts rules on an advent calendar? I muttered under my breath. What rules? My wife asked, walking into the room with a tray of freshly baked cookies. I showed her the note, expecting her to laugh or roll her eyes. Instead, she just shrugged. Maybe it's part of the charm? Some old-fashioned tradition? Yeah, maybe, I said, though something about it still felt off. Over the next few days, I tried to ignore the calendar. Alex opened one door each morning, pulling out a new figurine. A reindeer, a sleigh, a Christmas tree. Each was beautifully made, and he treated them like treasures. But the more he played with them, the more uneasy I felt. For one thing, the smell I'd noticed on the first night hadn't gone away. It wasn't strong, but it lingered, faint and sour, like something old and decaying. My wife didn't seem to notice it, and Alex was too busy with his new toys to care. And then there were the figurines themselves. Each one seemed to have a faint, oily residue on its surface, similar to the texture of the calendar's wood. It was subtle, but it was there. When I mentioned it to my wife, she brushed it off as harmless. Maybe it's the polish they used, she suggested. But the strangest thing was what happened on the third night. Alex had forgotten to return the day's figurine, a tiny wooden angel, to the calendar before bedtime. I didn't think much of it until I walked into the living room later that evening. The angel was gone from where he'd left it on the coffee table. At first, I thought Alex had come back downstairs to put it away himself. But when I opened the third door of the calendar, it was empty. The angel wasn't there either. I searched the entire living room, checking under the couch and behind the tree, but it was nowhere to be found. Finally, I gave up and decided not to mention it. Alex would be upset if he thought he'd lost one of his new treasures. The next morning, I watched Alex open the fourth door. This time, it was a tiny drum, its surface painted with red and gold stripes. As he held it up to the light, I caught a glimpse of the third door, the one that had been empty the night before. The angel was there now, sitting neatly in its slot as though it had never been missing. I didn't say anything, but my stomach tightened. I stared at the calendar, its dark wood gleaming faintly in the morning light. There was no logical explanation for what I'd just seen. That night, I reread the note. Always return the item to the calendar before midnight. It was such a simple rule, but now it felt heavier, like a warning rather than a suggestion. By the fifth day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The calendar seemed different. Its edges looked sharper somehow, and the carvings appeared deeper, more intricate, as if they'd been etched further overnight. I tried to bring it up with my wife again, but she laughed it off. "You're overthinking it," she said, brushing flour off her hands. "It's just a decoration. Relax." I wanted to believe her. I really did. But as I stood in the living room that night, staring at the calendar in the dim glow of the Christmas tree, I felt a chill run down my spine. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that makes every creak of the floorboards sound louder than it should. I moved closer to the calendar, peering at its surface, and for a moment, I thought I saw something shift. A flicker of movement behind one of the unopened doors. My heart pounded, but when I blinked, it was gone. I stepped back, shaking my head. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself. "It's just a wooden box. Nothing more." But deep down, I wasn't so sure anymore. The calendar wasn't just a decoration. it was something else. Something I didn't understand yet. And the rules, simple as they seemed, felt like they were meant for a reason. As the days went on, I became more certain of one thing. Breaking those rules wasn't an option. The following days blurred together, and with each passing one, the unease that had settled in my chest only deepened. By the time Alex opened the 7th door of the advent calendar, I couldn't shake the feeling that things were changing. It wasn't just the calendar anymore, though that was still a source of discomfort. It was everything around me. It was like my sense of reality was becoming slightly warped. One afternoon, as I walked through the hallway of the house, I passed by the bathroom and noticed the door slightly ajar. I distinctly remembered it being locked before. I had checked it earlier because the lock sometimes jammed, and I didn't want Alex to accidentally get stuck inside. But now it was open, not wide, but just enough to notice. I paused, staring at the gap. Maybe it's nothing, I whispered to myself. Maybe I just forgot to lock it. But even as I said the words, they didn't feel convincing. Later that evening, I had to check on Alex's room before I could relax. He had been playing with his new figurines, but when I opened the door, I froze. The room was completely still. Too still. For a moment, I thought Alex might be hiding somewhere, playing some sort of game. But as I scanned the room, I noticed something strange. His toys, the ones that had been scattered on the floor the day before, were now all neatly placed on his desk in perfect order. And at the center of the desk, the little wooden angel from the calendar, the one that had gone missing. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Alex," I called, walking further into the room. There was no response. I checked under the bed and in the closet, but there was no sign of him. I stepped back into the hallway, closing the door softly behind me. My mind was racing, but I couldn't find a single explanation for what had just happened. That night, when I went to bed, I thought about the advent calendar again. The rules that seemed so trivial at first now felt more like warnings. Each time I followed them, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being pulled deeper into something I didn't understand. The small details kept creeping up on me. The way the figurines had started to seem more lifelike, the odd way the calendars would gleam in the light, the strange whispering sound I heard every time I got too close to it. I couldn't be sure if I was imagining it or not. Maybe it was all in my head. Maybe the stress of the holiday season was getting to me. But as I lay there, eyes wide open in the dark, I heard it again. A faint rustling noise coming from downstairs. I held my breath, straining to listen. It was soft, almost imperceptible. I waited for it to stop, but it didn't. It just kept going. The following day was when things really started to feel wrong. I was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through my phone when a notification from the hospital popped up. It was a standard alert. A new patient had been added to the roster. I opened the message, expecting to read the usual details, but when I saw the name, my stomach dropped. The patient listed was someone I didn't recognize. I immediately checked the room number and tried to recall if anyone had been admitted recently. But there was no such patient on the list. The roster was full, and I was certain that this name hadn't appeared before. My pulse quickened, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. Maybe it was a mistake, I told myself. A typo or a mix-up in the system. But as I went back to the screen, the patient's name was still there, as clear as day. I quickly glanced around the room, as if someone might be watching me. The walls, the furniture, they felt too still, too quiet. That night, I stayed up later than usual. I had to sort through some work, and the quiet was almost comforting. But then, something happened. The lights in the kitchen started flickering. At first, I thought it was just a malfunction, a bulb about to burn out, but it kept happening, flicker, flicker, flicker. The hum of the refrigerator seemed louder too, like it was struggling to keep running. The air felt thick, heavy, like the house was holding its breath. I tried to ignore the feeling, focusing on the task at hand. But the flickering wouldn't stop. It became rhythmic, almost like someone was playing with the lights. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Silence. Later that night, as I walked past the living room, I caught a glimpse of something in the reflection of the window. It was a figure. For a split second, I thought I saw someone standing in the room, but when I turned around, the space was empty. My heart raced and I stood frozen in place. I scanned the room carefully, but there was no one there. Still, the feeling didn't fade. It was like someone or something was watching me. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like the walls were closing in. I walked quickly to the kitchen and grabbed a glass of water, trying to calm my nerves. The flickering lights still haunted my mind. Had I seen something? Was I losing my grip on reality? The next morning, I walked downstairs and stopped dead in my tracks. The calendar. It had changed. The figurines were gone. All that remained was a small piece of paper. I unfolded it, my hands trembling. You have broken the rule. Now you must pay the price. I stared at the words, my mind racing. This couldn't be happening. It didn't make sense. The figurines, Alex, everything felt like it was spiraling out of control. I tried to tell myself it was just a prank, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was something else at play here, something beyond what I could understand. And as I looked around the room, I could feel it again, the sensation of eyes on me, watching, waiting. The house felt heavier as the days wore on, each corner steeped in a strange kind of silence. I couldn't tell if it was my imagination or if something truly had changed. Maybe it was the calendar, or maybe it was the way I had started seeing things. It was the middle of the night when it all came to a head. I woke up with a jolt, my heart pounding as I heard a low hum echoing through the house. It wasn't the usual hum of the refrigerator or the faint whir of the heating system. The sound was different. It was deep, almost mechanical. I glanced at the clock, 3 a.m. The house was dark, save for the sliver of moonlight coming through the window. I couldn't tell if it was the same unsettling noise I'd heard earlier, but it felt different. Something was wrong. I threw the covers aside and got out of bed. As I walked down the hallway, my feet felt heavy on the floor. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, a presence just out of sight. Every step I took was met with an odd stillness, like the house was holding its breath. When I reached the kitchen, I froze. The lights were on, bright, almost blindingly so. But the oddest part? The fridge was open. The hum grew louder. The cold air from the fridge seemed to leak into the room, making my breath mist in the air. I reached for the door to close it, but my hand stopped just short. Inside the fridge, nestled between the items on the top shelf, was the calendar. It was glowing. I didn't know why or how. It shouldn't have been possible, but there it was, its wood glowing faintly with an eerie light. And there, beside it, was the little angel figurine, the one that had been missing, staring back at me. I slammed the fridge door shut, my heart racing. I wasn't sure what to do. My mind felt scrambled, and the strange sensation that I was being watched had returned, stronger than before. My eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of movement, any trace of someone, or something lurking just beyond my vision. That's when I saw it. A figure, standing in the hallway, just beyond the kitchen. It was hard to make out in the shadows, but I could see the shape clearly. Tall, thin, motionless. I froze. I didn't even know if it was real. For a second, I thought it might be Alex playing a prank on me. But no, this was something different. "Alex," I whispered, my voice shaking. There was no response. The figure didn't move. It was as though it wasn't even aware of me. or perhaps it was waiting for me to come closer. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get out of the house, but my feet wouldn't move. I stood there, rooted to the spot, unable to tear my eyes away from the figure. But it didn't advance. It just stood there. My breath grew shallow, and the reality of the situation began to sink in. I had two choices: stay here, do nothing, confront it, get closer. I glanced back toward the living room, where the advent calendar still lay. The glowing light from the fridge was still burning in my mind. Something told me that whatever was going on, it wasn't just a coincidence. The calendar, the figure in the hallway, everything felt like a puzzle, and I was the one trapped inside it. The figure in the hallway didn't move, didn't speak. It just lingered, watching me. I could feel my palms sweating, my body growing cold. I needed to make a decision, but none of my options felt safe. If I went toward the figure, I didn't know what would happen. If I stayed, would it just wait? Was it waiting for something? But I knew one thing for sure. Something had to be done. I forced myself to take a step forward. Just as I moved, the lights in the kitchen flickered, and then everything went dark. The hum, the noise I had heard earlier, stopped abruptly. In its place was a deafening silence. I stumbled, reaching out for the nearest object to steady myself. My hand brushed against the kitchen counter, but the texture of it felt wrong, felt wet, slick. I pulled my hand back quickly, feeling my heart race. What was happening? Why was everything so off? I took another step, but I couldn't see a thing. The darkness swallowed me whole, and the only sound I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. Suddenly, the hum started up again, louder than before. I stumbled back in the direction I thought the fridge had been, but the room seemed to stretch, like I was walking in circles. The walls felt too close, the air was too thick, and then I heard something else. A soft whisper, barely audible over the hum. I couldn't make out the words, but it was like a voice. Close, too close. I spun around, trying to locate the source, but the room was empty, just the hum and the whisper. The whisper grew louder, and in that moment, something inside me snapped. I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't just stand there, unsure if I was losing my mind or if something truly was happening. I ran toward the living room, but the hallway stretched out before me like an endless tunnel. I reached for the light switch, but it did nothing. The darkness pressed in from all sides, and the cold air that had been seeping into the house from the fridge now seemed to engulf me. I was choking on the silence. The pressure in my chest was unbearable. My mind was spiraling. What was real? What was happening? I slammed my fist into the wall, desperate for something solid, something I could control. That's when the figure reappeared. But it wasn't in the hallway anymore. It was right in front of me. I didn't know how, but I was face to face with it. And this time, it moved. I couldn't process what happened next. The figure raised its hand, slowly, deliberately, and I had to make my move. I had to choose. The calendar, the figure, the whispers, all of it. It was leading to something, and I was the one caught in the middle. The house was quiet again, but the silence felt heavier, like something had shifted, and I wasn't sure if it would ever go back to normal. The events from the night, those strange, inexplicable moments, had left me with more questions than answers. The next morning, I woke up on the couch, disoriented, as though the world I had known before the night felt distant. My body ached in places I didn't remember moving, but I didn't care. I felt numb. When I looked around, everything appeared normal. The kitchen, the living room, the hallway, but nothing felt the same. I tried to convince myself that it had all been a bad dream, that the figure, the strange noises, the whispers, maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, stretched thin from lack of sleep, stress, and the constant pressure of life. But even as I thought that, the nagging feeling that something was off wouldn't leave. There was still that unease, a quiet dread that hung in the air, refusing to dissipate. I glanced at the calendar that had been sitting on the kitchen counter since that night. Its glow was gone, but I couldn't bring myself to touch it. I avoided looking at it, unsure if I would see something new, something waiting for me. As I went about my day, something subtle began to change. The sounds in the house, once normal and familiar, now felt like whispers. Soft creaks of the floorboards, the hum of the fridge, even the wind outside. It was like the house had learned to breathe with me, every movement in sync with my own anxious thoughts. Every knock at the door sent a shiver through me. I would stand there, frozen, every muscle tight, heart racing. Sometimes, when I would open the door, no one would be there. Other times, I'd catch the faintest hint of someone standing just out of sight, but there was never anyone. The thing that really bothered me was the reflection in the mirror. The face staring back at me didn't look like mine anymore. It was as if something had changed subtly but undeniably during that night. I couldn't explain it. My own eyes seemed different, like they had seen something they weren't supposed to see, something I couldn't remember, but that I could feel pressing at the edge of my mind. Even now, months later, I find myself second-guessing the most ordinary things. The flicker of a light, the faintest noise at night. It all takes me back to that moment in the hallway, when I first saw that figure standing still watching me. I know what I saw, or at least I think I do, but the more I try to rationalize it, the more it slips through my fingers like trying to hold on to sand. I can't explain what happened that night. I don't know if I ever will. The calendar is still sitting in the corner, untouched, collecting dust. I've never opened it again. And sometimes, just sometimes, I feel like it's watching me. That feeling of being watched hasn't left. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I think I hear something. A footstep, a whisper, a rustle in the corner of the room. I tell myself it's just my imagination, but deep down, I know. What if that figure wasn't just a figment of my mind? What if it was something else, something that's still out there, still watching? I tell myself it's over, that whatever I experienced was just a strange, twisted chapter in my life that I can put behind me. But I can't shake the feeling that it's not finished. Did I really survive that night? Or am I still trapped in some kind of nightmare I can't escape? I don't know. All I have are these unanswered questions that seem to echo through the house, haunting me in a way that no rational explanation ever could. I don't know why the fridge door was open that night. I don't know why the calendar glowed or why the figure in the hallway never spoke. Maybe it was a sign, a warning, or maybe it was something else entirely. Something far worse than I can comprehend. The more I try to forget, the more it lingers. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I feel the coldness of the house wrapping around me once more. That sensation of being trapped in a place where I don't belong. Every creak, every shadow, every cold gust of wind brings me back to that night. I can't escape it. The worst part is I'll never really know. I'll never have the answers I'm searching for, and I'm not sure if I want them. But that doesn't stop me from wondering. Every knock at my door makes me freeze, just in case. I don't know what's out there. I don't know if it's really over. But I know one thing for sure, whatever it was, it's still with me. And the worst part? I can't seem to shake the feeling that it's waiting for me to make the wrong move. I'll be looking over my shoulder for the rest of my life. Subscribe for more horror stories every day.